Hello, everybody. We've arrived at our fifth and final episode. With me, as always, is our friend Adam. How are you, Adam?
Well, thank you, Karen. A demanding 5 episodes, but I hope they have helped any new Italians arriving in Italy.
Without a doubt, they have been useful for me too, and I already knew quite a bit about this country.
Well, there's always something to learn after all.
And today we're going to talk about the place where we spend our daily lives. The towns and the cities. It's a place that can be friendly, stimulating, and welcoming. However, newcomers often find it cold, distant, and incomprehensible. Will you help us to find our way in this place, Adam?
Well, I'll try. By city, you mean everything that concerns our daily lives: housing, local services, shelter and support centers, etc.
Exactly. But I'd like to start out with a more general introduction, if that's okay with you. Many foreigners arriving in Italy come from countries where the concept of the city is very different from what we find in Italy. What are the characteristics of Italian towns and cities?
Well, first of all, I should mention that Italian towns and cities have undergone some huge changes since the 60s and 70s of the last century.
What happened between the 60s and 70s?
Well, you should understand that before that time, the Italian economy was primarily based on agriculture, crops and livestock, or craftsmen. The industrialization that accompanied the recovery after the Second World War, and commonly known as the economic miracle, led to a significant transformation of the towns and cities.
As we mentioned in the first episode. What happened then?
Well, as industrialization progressed, many people from the south moved to the north of Italy, from the countryside and mountains to the towns and cities where the factories needing a larger workforce were located.
And these workers were in need of new homes to live in. It's a dynamic that we have seen repeated a few decades later in countries where many immigrants are coming from.
Exactly, and the comparison is valid because even that was an earlier form of internal migration in Italy. And like that, even our migration, yours and all of our viewers, is helping to transform Italian towns and cities once again.
We are living in a world that is ever-changing, but let's pause for a moment on the transition to an industrial society. I imagine that such an important development involved other spheres of society.
Well, that's right. The industrial society brought with it changes to the makeup of families and the roles they had. But the most significant change was undoubtedly in the reduction of the household. Families in rural societies were numerous and sometimes consisted of several families living under one roof.
That's true because a larger family ensured a greater number of workers in the fields.
Whereas in industrial societies, the number of family members reduced. There are parents with few children and usually no elderly people are present. Here's another consequence of industrialization. The introduction of women into the workforce meant that it was necessary to delegate the task of caring for the family to society, such as kindergartens and nurseries, support services and shelter facilities for the elderly unable to care for themselves.
This transformation has certainly changed some of the Italian population's habits in a very short time, too.
Yes, as we said before, in little more than 20 years, from the late 50s until the mid-70s.
These transformations must have also changed how people spend their home lives.
Absolutely. The transfer to the city has completely modified how people live at home, since they no longer have the larger spaces available in the countryside, nor do they have large family units. Relations with your neighbors and the rules governing living together have always changed. Nowadays, this typical form of cohabitation is in the condominium.
The condominium, namely a residential building where there are many homes and where each residence is usually a single-family unit.
Well, the way I see it, the condominium should act as a small community of people or a large family living under one roof, sharing problems, committed to supporting the management costs of their apartment, as well as those in common, a place where you can give and receive help and solidarity should you need it.
Of course, a condominium lived like this would be an important support during our stay in Italy. The first part of this episode is dedicated to what it means to live in a condominium in Italy.
Well, I would start off by saying that our beliefs, customs and habits can influence our relationships with other people, family, friends and neighbors. The way we act can bring people together in a positive way and improve our lives, but it can also be a source of annoyance, disturbance, of misunderstanding and conflict.
Do problems occur quite frequently in a condominium?
Well, of course it all depends on how we behave with others. When many people and families live in close contact, the chances that problems and communication difficulties arise are generally quite high. Living under the same roof, you have to mediate between individual freedom, which everyone has the right to exercise at home, and the collective needs determined by all the inhabitants of the condominium.
Are condominium regulations, especially those regarding misunderstandings and disputes, governed by law?
Yes, a particular jurisprudence exists, a collection of specific laws and sentences that defines the rules concerning living in a condominium. Which brings us to the condominium administrator.
We'll meet him more in depth later, but before we do, tell us briefly about what they do.
Yes, we'll meet him quite often, in fact. The administrator is responsible for every aspect of running the condominium, including, of course, the resolution of problems that may arise.
Actually, how important is it for foreigners arriving in Italy to know about this?
Well, it's very important. As I mentioned above, condominiums are also transforming, increasingly becoming intercultural places where Italians and foreigners from many different countries find themselves living together.
I can imagine that the contact between vastly different beliefs, habits, and customs requires a lot of care and goodwill.
I couldn't have said it better. Nothing can be taken for granted. You can find yourself in front of people who not only are unaware of the habits and customs of the place where they arrive, but have no idea that condominium regulations or specific communal ordinances and laws even exist. So I hope this information will be useful to you all.
It will be, I'm sure. Let's repeat what we mean when we talk about condominiums.
Under law, a condominium is a building which has private and common spaces belonging to individuals or corporate entities, such as companies, organizations, associations, etc.
So the condominium is basically a building consisting of two types of spaces. Some are common areas, such as staircases and service facilities, whereas others are private, such as homes, garages, and shops.
That's right. The meaning of the word condominium in Italian means possession exercised in conjunction with other people.
So are these common parts managed by the administrator?
Yes, even if this person has a wider-ranging role. In general, the administrator supplies the homeowners and renters with information that is useful and necessary for relations inside the condominium, as well as providing them access to building estimates, invoices, decisions, and the accordance with condominium regulations.
Regulations, right. What are these regulations?
The regulations contain all the rules for the management of the condominium, the things that can and cannot be done within it, and the rights and duties of the homeowners. These regulations are in reference to Italian laws and regulations in force at a local level, such as the ordinances of the local health authority or the police.
Therefore, every new homeowner has to have access to these regulations and know them to avoid breaking them and incurring penalties.
Exactly. The rules are more or less similar in every building, but it's always a good idea to inquire about specific issues, as in some condominiums, the color of the awnings or the times when you can throw trash away are governed by regulations.
In fact, I had already noticed this myself. For example, we can't keep pets inside my condominium, whilst it's allowed in my friend Sarah's building.
Indeed, that's why you can understand that things taken lightly can affect our peaceful stay in a condominium.
Let's take one step back a second. Before you even step foot in a condominium, you have to find a home.
If you are looking for a home to rent, there are two main places that you can turn to depending on your needs. If after taking up residence...
Forgive me for interrupting you, but I just wanted to remind you that we spoke about residency in the second episode.
Okay, that's true. And we should also remember that once you have your residency, a foreign citizen looking for a home in Italy can contact the local council to access public housing at a reduced fee, as well as other financial aid for paying for their rent. Some councils provide housing with different rates available to people without an adequate income.
This is because a home, as we were saying, is a right that Italian law provides for anyone residing in this country.
Exactly. Unfortunately, the demand is so large and the availability of public housing is so low that in many cases you need to look for a home on the market, as it's commonly called.
Through an estate agent, you mean?
Yes, the estate agents are by and large your main reference point, even if they often charge a fee for their services. Which is why I suggest that you shouldn't underestimate offers from private individuals which can be found in the advertising section of free newspapers or sometimes found posted in public places such as schools, stations, and bus stops.
Great. Once you have the home that meets your needs, what are the issues you should be particularly careful with?
The first thing is to make sure that your landlord is willing to sign a lease, since not having a rental contract not only leaves you vulnerable to scams, but is illegal and deprives you of your rights regarding housing.
Yes, but sometimes paying under the table, as they say, is cheaper.
Yeah, of course. But not paying any taxes on your rent means that you can save anything from 10 to 15%. However, not having a contract means that the landlord is not subject to certain obligations expected by law, such as paying for the building's yearly service charges and unforeseen maintenance costs, the replacement of home appliances, for example. In the end, it rarely turns out to be a good deal.
So, you recommend a contract. What are the most important things to check on before you sign?
Without a doubt, it's important to clarify the financial aspects mentioned in the contract, the rental fee and the bureaucratic costs regarding the production and registration of the contract, as well as any additional expenses such as fixed service charges.
What services fall under service charges?
Well, many actually. The building's central heating, the lift, cleaning the staircase, the courtyard and garden maintenance, the condominium administrator's fee.
Can you find out how much these charges are before signing the lease?
Well, yes, for example, it might help if you ask the landlord for last year's condominium budget with a breakdown of the charges.
Okay, so what are the different types of leases that you can get in Italy?
Well, there are two main types of contracts for renting a house or an apartment: the free market contract and the cooperative contract.
Two types. We've included them on this chart here. What do you mean by free market contract?
A free market contract is based on an agreement between those renting out the apartment, the landlord, and those renting it, the tenant. Such contracts usually last 4 years with an automatic renewal of another 4 years.
4 plus 4 then. What about the cooperative contract?
This type of contract is based on agreements reached between an owners' association and the tenants' association. The rent is usually lower than the market value, with possible tax incentives for the owner and much more flexible forms of contract. This type of contract varies from area to area depending on the agreements decided upon at the local headquarters.
So they're different from town to town. There are some standard types, however, that we could show as an example.
Yes, we can put them into 3 main categories. The first is the contract for residential use, which lasts 3 years plus an extra 2. This type of contract is usually increased to 4 plus an extra 2 years and provides tax relief for the owner and tenant.
Right, so what are the other 2 types?
There are 2 special cases. The second one is the temporary contract that lasts anything from 1 to 18 months. It isn't renewable and only applicable for when a short stay in the home is required. The third one is the contract for university students, which lasts for 6 to 36 months. This only applies in cities that have universities and gives no tax benefits.
However, there are other situations where the contract is agreed on directly by the 2 parties.
Yes, these are 2 very specific cases: a sublet contract where a tenant rents out part of the home to another person, and a loan contract where the house is granted free of charge under specific circumstances.
Well then, the choice to rent a home is not to be taken lightly. Who can I go to for information and advice about my choice?
Well, there are 3 main services you should remember, all easy to find on the website shown on the screen. The Tenants Union, www.unioneinquilini.it, which represents the associations for anyone renting a home, and 2 unions, SICET, the Union for Housing and Land Tenants, and SUNIA, S-U-N-I-A, the Union for Tenants and Assignees. You can contact them through websites www.sicet.it and www.sunia.it.
Now that we've finished the part about renting, we can look at buying a home.
Let me start by saying that as far as buying a home in Italy, it represents a significant expenditure. The hope is that sooner or later all foreigners will have the chance to buy a home, as it means that Italy has really become your permanent home.
Well, it's certainly a hope that we all have.
That said, buying a house or apartment is very complicated, and you should pay close attention to every step. My advice is to get help from an estate agent or a specialized association, as it is easy for buyers to find themselves facing unpleasant surprises.
What checks can you carry out before you buy a home?
Well, I've put everything down regarding this issue on the screen. Necessary requirements for buying a home. It is fundamental to check for the following. The home has been built according to current standards. Ask the seller for the building permit and the habitation certificate. If parts that have been built or modified do not show up on the initial construction documents, you should ask the seller whether they have requested an amnesty for the infringement of local building regulations, and if they have such documents from the local council. You need to check that the property has been properly registered at the Catasto Land Registry Office, and check that there are no mortgages or secured financial loans on the property.
So this is so you can find out and make sure that the property you're buying corresponds to the law without any hidden surprises.
Exactly. Be extremely careful when dealing with attractive prices or incredible opportunities. They may be a scam.
Let's say that everything is fine. What other issues should you pay particular attention to?
There are other technical issues that don't depend on the state of the house, which are good to discuss before you start any negotiations. For example, if the utilities, heating and water, are centralized or not. If they are centralized, you should ask to see the condominium budget to get an idea of how much it costs and how the utility costs are divided. You should find out how much the service charges are in the condominium, the use of an elevator, the cleaning of communal areas, the cost of lighting the stairs and so on.
And I imagine you should find out about any pending issues. If there are any unpaid service charges by the previous tenant or major renovation work to carry out, for example, fixing the roof, replacing guttering, paving the parking area, etc. Who should you turn to for an explanation and a verification?
Well, these phases of the negotiation are performed by a notary who may ask the administrator to produce a declaration about unpaid debts to the condominium.
So it's always a good idea to get advice from consultants who deal in such matters.
Absolutely, as there are some particularly complex steps during negotiations. However, the sale usually follows some specific steps. Firstly, the buyer makes an offer which demonstrates a substantial commitment between the buyer and seller. The seller, of course, can accept or refuse the offer.
Do you need to pay anything at this stage?
Yes, very often an advance is expected, known as a deposit, a guarantee that the buyer is genuinely interested. Once the offer has been accepted, the buyer and seller proceed to sign the preliminary contract, which is a formal commitment to the eventual completion of the purchase. This document has to show the amount of the deposit and the total price of the home, as well as the date when the deed of sale will be signed.
What if the details provided in the preliminary contract are not respected? Are there any penalties to pay?
Well, of course, well done for reminding me, in fact. Expect them always, which is why it's always a good idea to proceed carefully without hurrying, to avoid the risk of having to pay fines or penalties and losing the money you left as a deposit.
Once again, may I repeat how you should seek advice from the experts who know how to help us with this important decision.
Definitely. The final phase of negotiations is completing the deed of purchase, performed by a notary. The deed is the act which declares the actual transfer of ownership against payment of the agreed sum. If the seller is still living at the property, it's a good idea to include the date they intend to vacate the property as a clause in the deed of purchase.
Are there any other additional costs that we haven't mentioned?
Well, given the difficulty in purchasing a home, we often use the services of an estate agent. Their fee usually ranges from 1% to 3% of the price of the property, paid by both the buyer and the seller.
By both parties. To conclude this part, Adam, I thought it would be useful to get some useful website links and include them where you can get information and support. The website of Italian notaries, www.notariato.it. The Association of Small Property Owners, www.asppi.it, and the website of Home and Utilities, www.casaeconsumi.it. At this point, you have rented or bought a home and are starting your life in the condominium. Let's see how it's organized. Let's go back to the administrator. What are their main responsibilities?
I'll put them up on the screen. As you can see, they cover all the needs that may arise in the condominium.
Can you tell us in concrete terms how any decisions are taken and communicated?
The most widespread system in Italy is the condominium assembly, involving all the owners of the apartments in the building. It represents the deliberative organ of the will of the owners, where they discuss and vote on decisions that will be then managed by the administrator.
Of what have we seen so far? The administrator is also in charge of the budget and financial management of the condominium, like the service charges.
Yes, each cost is collected in the condominium's budget report, presented annually at a special condominium assembly. It covers the communal expenses, their division among homeowners, the further subdivisions between owners and tenants, the collection system of the payment quota of each homeowner, and the date when payments are due. It is a very important document which ensures that everybody's rights are respected and that each owner carries out their duties towards the others.
Of course. As to the potential problems that may occur living in condominiums, I'd like to dedicate a little more time so as to be more detailed. Adam, I have a few questions to ask you which I think will interest our viewers.
Well, it'll be my pleasure to answer them. Go ahead. The duties of the administrator of the condominium: convene assemblies, carry out the decisions taken at the assembly, enforce the building regulations, regulate the use of communal matters to everyone's satisfaction, collect payment from the homeowners in accordance with the allocation of service charges, take legal action against anyone who fails to pay the service charges, pay the costs of routine maintenance and any extra expenses in the communal parts of the building, inform and document the expenses incurred in the condominium.
Please allow me to begin with a little preamble. The habits and customs of each individual, the generational and cultural differences, the particular customs and habits of their hometowns, their personal living conditions, the different knowledge or absent knowledge of laws and regulations, the different languages. These are all cases where different lifestyles can lead to misunderstandings and create conflicts with people living next to us. And in a condominium, where many people live in the same building, similar issues are likely to profoundly affect life in Italy.
You're absolutely right. Although I would say that the easiest way to solve any problems that may arise is to show care and respect towards the people who live next to us. Only by putting yourself in their shoes can you understand why some issues are so important. There are some cases where such care isn't enough to ensure a peaceful relationship for reasons beyond the courtesy and knowledge of the laws. In these cases, the building regulations, the law, and the administrator all provide solutions to the problem.
In fact, I'd like to illustrate some of these cases with your help, if you may, or at least some of the most common, and try to provide some guidelines as how to find a possible solution. We're counting on your help.
Well, especially since the laws regarding condominiums are very complex and sometimes contradictory. Unfortunately, we can only indicate prevailing trends in the solution of such matters. The desirable solution is to seek a civil agreement based on the compliance with laws and regulations which satisfy both parties.
And if this isn't possible?
Well, you can always take legal action, i.e. to act through the law and a lawyer. But remember that this road is very long and incurs considerable costs. And if in the end it all goes wrong, you will be found guilty and forced to pay all the costs.
So it's a good idea to think about it thoroughly and be sure you're on the right side before making this decision. Well, let's get a little bit more specific straight away with our first example, which has to do with the number of people who can live in an apartment. Is there a number of legal residents inside a home which risks breaking the law?
Of course, the presence of many people in the apartments of the building can generate excessive overcrowding, especially if their going to and fro is frequent. Not to mention that this may create problems in the distribution of service charges or the relationship between tenants and strangers passing through communal areas. However, in general, fixed limits exist for the occupation of a single room, a studio apartment, with one inhabitant for up to 28 square meters and only 2 inhabitants for up to 38 square meters.
Therefore, is there a ratio between the size of the apartment in square meters and the number of people who can live there?
In conventional apartments, there has to be an area of at least 14 square meters for each of the first 4 residents. and 10 square meters for any subsequent residence. If these limits are not respected, you can talk of overcrowding and administrative or penalty countermeasures can be taken.
Is this the case even if I have a lease?
If you are renting the apartment, only the persons mentioned in the contract are allowed to live there. The only ones who need not be included are close family members, spouses, and children.
And when you have a guest for a long period, after what amount of time should their stay be considered as permanent?
It is common practice that after a stay of 15 to 20 days, the number of occupants in the apartment should be communicated to the administrator so that they can make a fair division of the service charges. In the absence of such direct communication, the administrator can gather information about the actual number of occupants in the apartment from neighbours, and on that basis make the calculation of the service charges.
So it's always a good idea to communicate all of this information to avoid having others do it for you.
That's right, but it isn't just a question of sharing the costs. The presence of unfamiliar people and new faces within the condominium can generate concern among residents and make the consequences more tedious and expensive.
I'll take this opportunity to ask you something linked to this, subletting. What's that all about?
Sublet means that a part of the home is rented out. A room or a whole wing of the home can be rented by the tenant to other people. It's a trend similar to the way hotels rent out rooms by the hour.
I see, but is subletting legal in Italy?
It's only possible if the initial rent contract allows it. There isn't a time limit in such case as to their stay or type of sublet, except for the number of tenants, which we mentioned earlier. However, if it isn't stipulated in the contract, then it is an abuse that can lead to very serious consequences.
Legal?
Yes, I'm afraid so. They can lead to an eviction, which is a judicial act where the landlord asks the court to issue an enforceable order that demands the tenant to return the property and the payment of additional charges. In the worst cases, you can even risk committing a crime, such as the illegal stay of persons or the aiding of illegal immigration. Therefore, take the utmost care and learn from your landlord if you are in a position to sublet part of your home for rent.
What if I sublet with a contract and hope to get away with it?
As I said earlier, the movement of persons unknown in a condominium is easily noticed by other people living there. If you sublet without a contract, you risk committing a crime of unlawful practice of a financial activity and of breaking numerous rules regarding permit and license fees.
The unlawful practice of a financial activity?
Yes, because renting out a home is in effect a financial activity that provides an income. The consequences in terms of fees to be paid can be very serious and even go as far as the seizure of the property and possessions in order to cover those expenses. A seizure is an act where you remove the possibility of a person in debt from using their assets and subsequently their private property if they fail to pay until their creditors are satisfied.
Thanks, Adam. Let's carry on with the possible drawbacks of life in a condominium. Let's take the example of having guests to stay. How much time should pass before I should report their presence to the Italian authorities?
In principle, you have to inform the police within 2 days, both for Italian and foreign guests. If a guest stays longer than 48 hours, you should immediately notify the owner, who will then report it to the authorities.
Are there any consequences to having an irregular or illegal immigrant stay with you?
If you are renting, then the owner of the house is at risk as well. The penalty consists of very high fines, and extreme cases may lead to the confiscation of the home itself, which is seized and becomes the property of the state. These requirements come under the anti-mafia law for Italians and EU citizens, and the immigration consolidated law for non-EU citizens.
Thanks, Adam. It's a good idea to be so specific. We now come to the issue of service charges. What happens when a tenant doesn't pay their share?
Well, the non-payment of service charges by a homeowner means that all the other homeowners have to cover the payment, which clearly adds a burden to their costs.
How do you go about obtaining the service charges, payment if the tenant doesn't pay?
The administrator, if stated in the contract regulations, can suspend the use of communal services of the tenant that are intended for their individual use. This, of course, depends on whether the services charges were not paid by the tenant or the landlord.
Let's look at both of them. What happens in the first case?
Well, if the tenant has not paid the service charges, they must be paid for by the landlord, who is ultimately responsible for them. If the debt of the tenant exceeds the amount of 2 months' rent, you can request eviction due to arrears.
Eviction? And what if the owner doesn't pay?
If the landlord doesn't pay the service charges, the administrator has the possibility to effect a cease and desist order, enforceable immediately. Once they achieve this and the debt still hasn't been paid, the administrator may proceed with the seizure of their private property or real estate. This is a time-consuming procedure and involves huge costs, initially paid by the condominium.
So the breakdown of these charges is linked to the number of inhabitants in your home.
Yes, that's the reason why you risk having a complaint lodged against you when you fail to declare the number of tenants, as the costs fall on the other homeowners in the building.
This brings us to the issues relating to your neighbors in the condominium. There are cases where a neighbor makes noise repeatedly, even during the night or for a long time, or other cases where we hear loud music during the hours for resting. What can be done when the noise is caused by some residents disturb the peace of other people?
This is an important argument. Naturally, the condominium regulations also contain precise rules for respecting the nocturnal hours.
Are there any limitations, such as for parties at home?
Well, there aren't any precise rules, although it is always a good idea to respect the peace of others. Residents who have been disturbed by noise can call the police directly to put an end to any disturbances. Should these disturbances be repeated over time, other than receiving a written warning from the administrator, you can sue the offenders.
By what law?
I'm referring to Article 844 of the Civil Code, which regulates the relations between neighbours and prohibits any emissions, fumes, noise and vibrations that exceed the tolerable standard. In the event of a subpoena, the proceedings will be handled by a justice of the peace or by a criminal court, depending on its severity.
Well, yes, we talked about that in the second episode. In the event of a complaint, you don't really need the help of a lawyer. So what penalties can be imposed?
Yes, you don't need the help of a lawyer. The judge will immediately inhibit the noisy activity or impose, if technically possible, the appropriate technical means to reduce the nuisance caused. The offender may be sentenced to pay damages to those who have suffered annoyance caused by noise.
And if the case is filed as a criminal case?
In that case, it is referred to Article 659 of the Penal Code, related to the disturbance of an occupancy and a person's rest.
Which in Italy is normally called the public peace.
Exactly. In that case, the prosecution begins with a protest and complaint act to the police, the carabinieri or the police force, which is immediately transmitted to the prefecture, responsible under Article 7 CPP, so that they can proceed with an investigation to verify the existence of a crime. Remember that any legal proceedings should be accompanied by the support of a lawyer in such cases.
There is a problem similar to this regarding the use and occupancy of the communal areas in the condominium.
Yes, I think that many have had to deal with communal spaces wrongly occupied with various objects, including bicycles, scooters, furniture, mattresses, wheelchairs and strollers, but also rubbish and waste material. These items prevent the intended use of the communal spaces and create problems of passage for people, as well as undermining the dignity of the building.
What should you do if some residents occupy the communal spaces with their objects?
The condominium regulations govern the use of common spaces. In cases of improper occupancy of such common spaces, the administrator initially sends a letter asking whether you may know if someone has broken the rules. The letters are generalized and addressed to all inhabitants if the individuals responsible are not precisely known. A deadline is given for the removal of the objects in question.
What happens if they're not removed?
At that point, the administrator can demand, as a result of a court action, the removal of the various objects by judicial officers. The total costs, removal, transportation, disposal, shall be charged to the owners of such property if their identity has been established. In the absence of the identification of those responsible, the costs will be distributed among the residents.
So the costs fall on those who live there. I've read that some buildings have a common room. What's that exactly?
You often find common rooms in some palaces, especially in older condominiums, such as playrooms for children or meeting rooms. In reality, you're almost always denied access and use. In practice, they are only used for those rare condominium assemblies.
So does using them for other purposes violate building regulations?
No, an absolute prohibition of use is quite rare. It depends on the administrator anyway. After they have consulted the residents, they can allow or prohibit the use of the premises. As for individual use, any extra costs incurred for cleaning, repair, and consumption are all down to the user.
Good. Let's change the subject now. One of the most important issues in a condominium linked to the different cultural habits or religions of the various residents regards food and nutrition.
That's an important point. There are cases where a building's occupants keep their food in unsealed containers, in open spaces or on terraces, dried fish, hung meat, etc., which releases strong and unpleasant smells. In other cases, people cook on the terrace or with the windows open, again letting out strong and sometimes unpleasant odors. The presence of these bad smells, or at least strong and unusual smells, may lead some to believe that there are spoiled foods, which may run the risk of spreading pests and diseases.
Let's start with this then. What are the rules governing the storage of food at home?
The main thing is to reduce the emissions of odors and foul-smelling fumes, which can sometimes be considered as a criminal offense and treated as the disposal of hazardous substances or noise disturbance. In order for bad smells to be considered as a crime, they should not be of a temporary nature and should be intolerable, or at least should provoke obvious physical discomfort, like nausea, disgust, loss of appetite, etc.
Who should be notified in cases when you fear the spread of disease?
Well, in these cases, the first thing to do is determine where the bad smell is coming from. Then go to your neighbors who are causing it and ask them to remove the goods or smelly foods. If the smell persists, you can lodge a complaint with the authorities and request the intervention of your local health authority to perform a health inspection and ensure that there is no risk to public health.
Can you also file a complaint even when there is no health risk?
Of course, but the process is rather long. You will need expert advice and a building inspection. It could also end up in front of the Justice of the Peace.
What exactly can lead to a guilty sentence?
If the bad smells are recognized as persistent and disturbing and therefore causing damage, the person responsible will have to pay a fine, plus all legal fees and possibly compensation for the moral and material damage suffered by their neighbors. You cannot, however, prohibit the use of certain foods if they cause no disturbance in terms of annoying smells or a risk to public health.
Which brings us to the next important point, foodstuffs. Many foreigners consume particular foods, sometimes from their own country, which may have been slaughtered according to a particular method, such as halal or kosher.
Yes, I would add that in some cases residents keep animals that are not pets in their homes. They are kept at home alive until they are slaughtered, which may cause blood to leak out onto the hallway, such as with sheep, lamb, poultry, etc.
Is this at all possible? Can residents keep live animals and slaughter them inside their apartment?
Normally, the building regulations prohibit the keeping of animals except for pets such as dogs, cats and fish, provided that they do not disturb anyone. Therefore, the keeping of other live animals is generally prohibited. Slaughter is even more so prohibited, as there are laws that prohibit such behavior outside of specialized areas, such as slaughterhouses.
The purposes of a religious ritual are therefore insufficient to permit such activity in an apartment or any other premises unfit for such a purpose.
Because only by carrying out certain procedures can you guarantee if an animal is healthy or not, as they can spread infections and parasites with hazardous consequences for public health.
Not to mention the fact that in large towns especially, there are many butchers who work in providing meat that respects the cultural or religious demands of foreign citizens.
Yes, and also respects animal rights according to Italian law. For example, the animal has to be stunned before it can be slaughtered, as minimizing the suffering of the animal is considered more important than any religious precept.
What might the consequences be should these standards be violated?
According to Article 20 of the 286/04 legislative decree, the slaughtering of animals, the cutting and storage of meat in an establishment not recognized or authorized by law shall be punished with imprisonment for up to 2 years or a fine of up to 60,000 euros.
Wow, as well as risking criminal proceedings for any cruelty to animals.
Yes, that's right. Article 544 of the Penal Code punishes with imprisonment of 3 to 12 months or a fine of anything from 3 to 15,000 euros for anyone using animals in such activities that should cause injury or cruelty. If it results in the death of the animal, such punishment can also be increased by a third.
So let's remember that you should always find out about the animals you can keep in your apartment and the places where you can buy meat that respects both religious beliefs and the Italian law. Okay, we can close this part of the episode with a final argument. The management of waste from the condominium. First of all, just what do we mean by waste?
Well, waste is any material derived from a human activity and destined for abandonment or destruction. Waste is classified as urban or special, depending on its origin, and how harmful or harmless, depending on its characteristics.
What do these definitions refer to?
Well, urban waste is household waste, including bulky items, garbage, and plant debris coming from gardens and parks. Special waste is waste coming from industrial processes or craftswork, sanitation items, and so on. Hazardous waste, on the other hand, is anything that contains high doses of dangerous substances, such as expired medicines or used batteries, urban waste, or waste from petrol refineries, the chemical industry, metallurgy, the textile and leather industry, special waste, which all must be handled according to special procedures.
The issue of waste management has become very important in Italy in recent years. I read that waste production increased considerably during the 90s.
Unfortunately, that was the case, and even today the majority of this waste is incinerated or put in a landfill, which has obvious consequences for the environment.
What good practices would you recommend to our viewers?
Well, 3 in particular: the reuse of an object rather than throwing it away, separate waste collection, and recycling. All these activities can ensure a considerable improvement of the environment where we live, and not just in Italy.
Absolutely. Living in a responsible manner is a duty for each one of us so that together we can preserve our planet and ensure a healthy and happy future for new generations. This way, they can learn the importance of sharing values and knowledge to ensure the health of nature and man.
Exactly, Karen. That's just what I wanted to say.
Who should we speak to for information on the correct way to manage waste?
Well, every institution, be it regional, municipal, or provincial, has a special organization for waste collection. So you should go to the council offices, usually the URP, the Public Relations Office, to find out how to dispose of your waste and understand which rubbish bins to use for the different types of wastes. The Public Relations Office will also show you where to find these waste collection centres or recycling centres, where you should take any bulky items no longer in use, such as packaging for home appliances, old furniture or broken home appliances, etc. Remember that you are not allowed to leave your waste on the street.
Very good. I hope you all remember these important tips so we can keep our country clean and beautiful. Speaking of beauty, let's pick up again on an issue we've already spoken about in the first and other episodes, the town and the local council where we live.
Indeed. Today we've spoken about homes and how we get, live in and care for our homes, including renting, taxation, rubbish, building regulations, etc. All of these refer to the rules of the town or city where we live, and therefore our local town council.
This is an important point. Remember, everyone, that our local council is like a reference point for anything to do with laws and the institutions which govern our lives. From the registry offices for our residence permits and the registration of birth certificates to schooling, especially for infants.
Speaking of which, may I remind you all about the social services, social workers, and health services as well, even if these are part of another institution at your local health clinic. Remember that many services and offices important for our daily lives are a part of the local council where we live.
So, what are we trying to say by all this then? Well, we should consider the local council as the reference point for anything regarding our civil life. From laws and regulations to marriage and work, the local council is also a place where you can go and ask for important information. We could say that the local council is the nearest institution for helping us with many different issues and problems.
Just think that apart from our home, the place where we live the most is our town or city, which is managed by the local council, such as urban hygiene regulations, street cleaning, traffic, transport, and so on. In short, the city is like a big communal home, which we should respect just as we respect our own homes. Of course, it should welcome us and work well too, but this depends on politics and how the institutions operate, as well as the behaviour of citizens, including all of you. And that's including anyone who's just arrived here.
We'd like to remind you once more just what the duties and functions of this big home or big condominium are. Or rather, just what are the duties of its institutions or administrator, and by that, I mean the local council.
Well, seeing as we're reaching the end of our series and our course, it's worthwhile repeating some of the more important points of the many that we mentioned so far.
All right, let's read this chart together, shall we? From the condominium to the city, the role of the local councils. You can obtain the following documents at the registry office: birth certificates, citizenship certificates, death certificates, civil status certificates, marriage certificates, attested affidavits, proof of residence certificates, family status certificates. Other offices: technical office, taxes and local taxes office, business office. Your local council is also your starting point should you need any help with health and social care.
Okay, and remember that the mayor of your local council is the public official of the registry office, which means that the mayor is the authority who has the duty to record and keep all the data on inhabitants and citizens inside the council's territory. The mayor entrusts this task to particular delegates through different offices such as the registry office or civil status office. These offices have the job of issuing important certificates at the request of citizens, such as birth certificates or others that we will see in our chart.
These certificates, such as your birth, civil status, or residence certificate, are also very important because you might need them for your citizenship application done at the prefecture.
Or for opening a business and so on.
So you can see why so many things concerning our daily lives pass through these council offices.
Another point we have already dealt with is social and medical assistance. The local council, as we can see from our chart, is the place to go regarding social and sanitary assistance, even though the local council often delegates these tasks to other institutions, your local health centre, for example. However, the local council is our starting point, our first point of contact for such problems.
Let's take a look at another chart that presents this important point, Adam, that of social assistance. The social worker, who are they and what do they do? Their main function is in the assistance of local social services. Needs addressed by the social services. The counseling or social service office deals with the occurrence of problems and through mediators eases access to and the awareness of such available services. Emergency help desk for disasters, extreme needs, protection from violence to fight the trafficking of human beings, especially women and children, child protection and child care, support services for school attendance, school bus, canteen vouchers, after schooling, etc., financial contributions, grants or credit, housing policies, funding for rent, council housing, etc., relationship problems in couples or alone as the context deems fit, visit family centers, training, support for going back to work.
We can see here just how many important points are described, can't we? From acceptance to emergencies and protection from violence to support for children at school.
Indeed, once again, we realize that through local institutions and our local council in particular, we can ask for information as well as support and help. In short, these institutions, especially those in towns and cities, should act as another big home to welcome us.
And always remember that we can easily find help from intercultural mediators at the social services offices of your local council, as well as other organizations that help immigrants, such as trade unions, sponsored organizations, or the ASLA. These people are important as they have almost always come here as immigrants. They have already been here for a long time, and they often speak your language. And above all, they know how to navigate through different situations and problems, from offices to questions to problems relating to work or school.
What we have just said is true in general for the whole of Italy. However, we saw that Italy is divided into 20 different regions. What does this mean for us?
Regions are territorial authorities that have some legislative power. Each region can regulate certain matters differently. One of these is the provision of social services and what to do regarding the acceptance and integration of migrants. The Emilia-Romagna region, for example, has a law that regulates action in favor of foreigners, LR 5, 2004.
A bit like a small state, which together with other regions form the nation state of Italy, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there has been recent talks of regional federalism. On the other hand, the region has a president elected by the inhabitants of that region. The president is the head of the council, which forms the government, and the legislative council assembly.
Which is the regional parliament that has the power to make regional laws. This, too, is also elected by the citizens of the region. I more or less knew this already, but perhaps you could tell us a little about the region where we are now, the region of Emilia-Romagna.
It'll be my pleasure. The region of Emilia-Romagna is located in northern Italy. It is made up of 9 provinces, and Bologna is its regional capital.
Let's see if I can remember all of them. From the north to the south, we have Piacenza, Parma, Reggio Emilia, Modena, Bologna, and Ferrara. Then there are the provinces of Ravenna, Forlì Cesena, and Rimini.
Well done. As well as knowing all the provinces, you probably also know that there are 4.5 million people living in Emilia-Romagna, of whom more than 500,000 are foreigners.
I also know that it is a region where the people are hospitable and industrious, and that it has an excellent level of health and social services.
Yes, it's a region that does a lot for immigrants here, even if it is difficult to find services devoted exclusively to foreigners. In fact, the region prefers that everyone uses the same services and goes to the same offices. This way, foreigners, with the help of intercultural mediators, shouldn't feel different from other Italians.
Therefore, it's better that we speak about opportunities for foreigners rather than the specific services available, such as mediators, intercultural centers, and Italian language courses.
Yes, as well as the places for foreign women and their children, which is of particular importance for women who have recently arrived in Italy and are still unable to orientate themselves between hospitals, obstetricians, gynecologists, pediatricians, etc.
One more thing. In the first episode, we spoke about the Office Against Discrimination, known as the UNAR. Is there one in Emilia-Romagna too?
Yes, and much more than that. There's a serious service working against discrimination which collaborates with the UNAR. It's called the Regional Centre Against Discrimination. This service not only receives reports about discrimination, but also offers support to victims and takes action to prevent and remove possible discrimination.
And where can you find it?
The Regional Centre Against Discrimination covers all the territory of the region. Should you need to report any cases of discrimination which you have been a victim of or a witness to, you should go to one of more than 200 places in the network. You can find them on this website, http://sociale.regione.emilia-romagna.it/contro-le-discriminazione, or by phoning this free phone number, 800.662200, or by going to your nearest centre for foreigners.
Well, Adam, once again it seems that we're touching on our first theme. Do you remember? The one where we started out, and perhaps the most important of all, that of our rights. The right to be accepted as well as the rules regarding such hospitality. And so here we're finally coming to the end of our series and our course on how to arrive and stay here in Italy.
So at this point we'd like to conclude by proposing a sort of final summary, a moment to sum up everything, hoping that our course will be of some help to you all.
In the first episode, as you may recall, other than looking at the data regarding the Italian population and the number of immigrants here, we spoke about the basic rules. The Italian Constitution, the rights and duties of every citizen, the right to health, education, and those relating to our basic freedoms. We should also try to remember these rights as well as our duties.
Then, in the second episode, we talked about the rules regarding visas, residence permits, and everything concerning the rights and obligations relating to your entry and residence in Italy.
In the third episode, we spoke about work, from our rights to the rules concerning work, including our payslips, the types of employment contracts, and the national insurance payments and pensions.
In the fourth episode, we spoke about school, the obligation and right to give our children an education, and the entire Italian scholastic system.
And then in our fifth and final episode, we spoke about the rules of coexistence when you live in a house or in a condominium along with other people, as well as living in a town or city, the local council where we live, and its offices and services. So here we are at the end. We hope you have all enjoyed our course.
And we hope that it can be especially useful for your life here in Italy.
So goodbye and the best of luck.
Goodbye, everybody. Good luck, and thanks for your time. Bye-bye.